II, there's just a terrible fear. And I think that's the right word.
Eric Sorensen, who was the president of MSNBC, told the New York Times, quote, "Any misstep and you can get into trouble with these guys and have the patriotism police hunt you down."
Yes. Well, he's the management guy, so his phone would ring. Nobody's going to call Donahue and tell him to shut up and support the war. Nobody's that foolish. It's a lot more subtle than that.
I think that what happened in the months leading up to the war is that there was a sort of acceptable mainstream opinion that got set. And I think that people who were seen as outside that mainstream were viewed as sort of fringe, and they were marginalized. You saw that in the demonstrators.
1, 2, 3.
How people demonstrating did not get much play.
5, 6, 7, 8. Stop the bombing, stop the hate.
We don't want no Iraq war. Joe Dick Cheney to the door.
So in October of 2002, 100,000 people in Washington, one of the largest, peace demonstrations in years in the United States. And the press just, the Washington Post put a photo on its Metro page.
Photographs ran with an article, but the paper's ombudsman later criticized the Post for not giving the story more prominence. Meanwhile, in the 6 months leading up to the invasion, the Washington Post would editorialize in favor of the war at least 27 times. What got even less ink than the protesters was the release of something called the National Intelligence Estimate. Before voting to give the president war powers, Congress asked the administration to detail all the top-secret evidence it was using to justify an invasion. The press got a declassified version. Most of the media gave it a cursory reading, but Jonathan Landay examined the text closely.
I got my copy, and I opened it up.
This is the white paper that they...
And I came to the part that talked about the aluminum tubes. Now, it said that the majority of analysts believed that those tubes were for the nuclear weapons program. It turns out, though, that that majority of intelligence analysts had no background in nuclear weapons.
Knight Ridder was on top of the most important story of the run-up to the invasion, the manipulation of intelligence to make the case for war. On October 4th, Landay wrote, "The White House and the Pentagon are pressuring intelligence analysts to suppress information that might undercut support for the war."
So here was yet another building block in this chain of building blocks that we had collected over these months about what they were saying to the public and what the intelligence was actually telling them. And there were differences. Some of them were nuanced, some of them were quite large. But it became quite apparent that they were grabbing just about anything they could to make the case for going to war in Iraq.
Over a dozen sources told Knight Ridder that the Pentagon was pressuring analysts to cook the intelligence books. Deep throats were talking, but few in the press were listening.
There are people within the U.S. government who object when they perceive that their government isn't being straight with the people, and when they perceive that an administration is veering away from the principles on which this country was built. They become more ready to talk about things that perhaps they ordinarily shouldn't.
Ayes are 296, the nays are 133, the joint resolution is passed.
Ignoring the reports of flawed intelligence, Congress gave the president the go-ahead for use of force. Knight Ridder's team just kept on digging. By the end of the month, their reporting had come full circle. Sources confirmed that the Pentagon was preparing for war based on information from Ahmed Chalabi and the Iraqi National Congress, despite objections from experts inside the CIA.
The administration can withstand the Knight Ridder critique because it wasn't reverberating inside Washington, and therefore people weren't picking it up.
We were under the radar most of the time at Knight Ridder. We were not a company that I think Karl Rove and others cared deeply about, even though in terms of readers, we're much bigger than the New York Times, the Washington Post. We're less influential. There's no way around that.
But there was a period when we were sitting out there, and I had a lot of late-night gut checks where I was just like, are we totally off on some loop here?
Yeah,
we're wrong? Are we going to be embarrassed?
Every day we'd look at each other and say, literally. And we'd find, one of us would find something out, and I'd look at him and I'd say, what's going on here?
But I think it's telling that they didn't really operate by that Beltway game, the way the networks, the cable channels, Newsweek, Time, New York Times, Washington Post, they seem to sort of operate outside that bubble. And look at what the benefits were when they operated outside that bubble. They actually got the story right. What's important is it's proof positive that that story was there and it could have been gotten, and some people did get it, but the vast majority chose to ignore it or not even try.
How many times did I get invited on a talk show? How many times did you get invited on a talk show?
I think maybe
not the big talk shows, not the big Sunday shows.
You know what? I'll tell you who invited me on the talk show. C-SPAN.
Television, especially cable television, has a sort of crossfire mentality. You put on the pro-Bush guest and the anti-Bush guest, and they go at it. You put on the let's go into Iraq, let's not go into Iraq, and they go at it. Well, that's what they do. They're pundits. But that's not a debate that's particularly well suited to shedding light on whether or not the Bush administration's case for war rested on some kind of factual basis. That's not what pundits do.
I mean, I really think the reason the United States has a bad reputation in the Arab world is that we have been on the side of dictatorships. We've been on the side of very corrupt, very backward governments in places
Peter
like Saudi
Bynett
Arabia.
became editor of the New Republic at age 28. During the run-up to the invasion, he was one of the hottest young pundits in town, a liberal hawk, accusing opponents of the war of being intellectually incoherent and echoing the official line that Hussein would soon possess a nuclear weapon.
We need a little bit of logistical support, but we don't need the moral support of anyone because we're on the side of the angels in this.
Had you been to Iraq?
No.
So what made you present yourself, if you did, as a Middle East expert?
I don't think that I presented myself as a Middle East expert per se. I was a political journalist. I was a columnist writing about all kinds of things. Someone in my position is not a Middle East expert in the way that somebody who studies this at a university is, or even at a think tank, but I consume that stuff. I was relying on people who did that kind of reporting and people who had been in the government, who had access to classified material for their assessment.
And you would talk to them, and they would, in effect, brief you, all background on what they knew?
Sometimes.
I'm trying to help the audience understand. How does you describe yourself as a reporter of political opinion, or a journalist of political opinion? How do you get the information that enables you to reach the conclusion that you draw as a political journalist?
Well, it was mostly, large part, it was reading. It was reading the statements and the things that people said. I was not a beat reporter. I was editing a magazine and writing a column. So I was not doing a lot of primary reporting, but what I was doing was a lot of reading of other people's reporting and reading of what officials were saying.
If we journalists get it wrong on the facts, what is there to be right about?
Well, I think that's a good point. But the argument in the fall of 2002 was not mostly about the facts. It was about a whole series of ideas about what would happen if we invaded.
What I'm trying to get at is how does the public sort all this out from out there beyond the Beltway? Far more people see Bill Kristol on television than will ever read the Associated Press reports or the Knight Ridder reporters. Isn't there an imbalance then in what the public is going to perceive about a critical issue of life and death, like war?
I think it's important for people. Look, would it be better if television were not the primary medium through which people got their news? Yes, that's why I do television, but I'm primarily in the business of writing and editing because I believe ultimately that words can convey more richer information than television. Would we be a better society if people got most of their news from print rather than television? Yes, I think we would.
One of the great pressures we're facing in journalism now is it's a lot cheaper to hire thumbsuckers and pundits and have talk shows on the air than actually have bureaus and reporters. And in the age of the internet, when everybody's a pundit, we're still going to need somebody there to go talk to the colonels, to be on the ground in Baghdad and stuff, and that's very expensive.
Reporting is hard. The substitute for reporting far too often has become, let's just ring up an expert. Let's see, these are experts on international armaments. And I'll just go down the list here and check Richard Pearl.
Once it begins to look as though he is relinquishing his grip on power, I think he's toast.
The choice is disarming him by war or letting him have these weapons of mass destruction.
This is journalism on the cheap, if it's journalism at all. Just pick up the phone, call an expert, bring an expert into the studio. Easy. Not time-consuming, doesn't take resources, and if you're lucky and good with your list of people, be an articulate person who will kind of spark up the broadcast.
The people at Knight Ridder were calling the colonels and the lieutenants and the people in the CIA and finding out, that intelligence is not very good. We should have all been doing that.
How do you explain that the further you get away